The bad weather crossing Montana is amassing all the characteristics of an atypical storm.
The Suicide of Rachel Foster is a horror-themed walking simulator in which you step into the shoes of Nicole, the daughter of an incredibly notable family going back to the family-owned hotel for an evaluation. Right at the start of the game, it is explained that your father had an affair with another woman, Rachel Foster, and after this news broke, Rachel committed suicide. In an effort to right the records, your mother has tasked you with selling the family hotel and donating the funds to the affected, as well as paying off Nicole's college debt. Before I talk about the game itself, I want to speak about the term walking simulator just to stop any comments from either camp. Yes, the term is used in a derogatory way by some, but in this review I do simply mean it as a genre description. You will still solve puzzles, but most of your time is spent walking between locations and listening to the dialogue between yourself and Irving, a man with contact to the hotel overseeing Nicole's stay. I personally think I have a pretty balanced take when it comes to the genre, as I have played a fair few and had a mix of different reactions, but I'll speak about them as they become more relevant. First things first, is this game any good? I think it's okay. If you like subtle horror and slowly building tension, this will probably tickle your fancy more than the average person. If you enjoy good writing and solid plot points in your walking simulators, then you'll probably enjoy this less than your average person. As someone who kind of enjoys both, I'm kind of torn on this game. It does quite a lot and each element varies quite wildly in terms of quality. But let's start with the easiest things to talk about. Aesthetically, it's a little bland. The hotel is a pretty cozy and an isolated cabin in the woods way, but it's also not that detailed. Upon starting a new game, the devs did include a line saying that the player should pay attention to the details to uncover the truth. I'm not 100% sure, but I think it's either implying that the story we are told isn't quite the truth, or that there is a decent amount of symbolism in the game. The point I am making is that as a result of this line, I did end up paying extra attention, and found in reality there just isn't really all that much to pay attention to, because for the most part the hotel is just kind of a hotel. I will say I appreciate the Shining vibe that has drawn so much tension, even if I think the comparison is a little weak for reasons I'll get into later. The next thing I want to talk about is the voice acting and writing. For the majority of this game, you'll be listening to the conversations between Irving and Nicole as mentioned earlier, and those range from believable to convenient. Nicole is written to be a snarky, very strong-headed woman that clearly has a level of patience but has been put into an uncomfortable situation. Irving, on the other hand, just seems to be a little bland, underwritten, and never seems to challenge Nicole at the start of the game, so their dynamic is actually really strange. Nicole is needlessly aggressive towards him, which I think makes enough sense, but what doesn't make sense is Irving's response. He never gets annoyed or pushes back in any way, and it just comes across very unnaturally. As Nicole warms to him, no pun intended, the dynamic becomes a lot more believable, so this isn't a huge issue, but I feel like the game could have opened a lot stronger. I personally thought that both voice actors did a pretty solid job with the material given, and believe my issues here lie more with the writing. Gameplay wise, it only has a few puzzles, but I did find myself enjoying them, and they added to the tone, which is by far the best thing that game has going for it. You will often be tasked with travelling towards an unknown noise or searching a cordoned off area, both of which are horror tropes for a reason, but this game won't catch you out with cheap jump scares and instead decides to give you story payoffs that simply add to the tension. If I have one complaint, it would be that all too often you end up playing a found object game where picking up certain objects will move the dialogue forward, so you end up scouring every corner of a room having bizarre banter about a pack of cigarettes despite just watching footage of the previous room's occupants being mauled to death by Satan himself. That doesn't actually happen, but it illustrates the tonal shift. It's a shame because the tension is built pretty effectively throughout the game, and without these moments, the overall impact would have been far greater. The only other element to the gameplay is much smaller and is a pretty basic dialogue choice mechanic. In one playthrough, it's hard to say whether my choices affected anything, but I'll talk about this mechanic later. And honestly, due to the story-based nature of the game, that's all I can really say without going into spoilers. Overall, if you're looking for a slightly vintage horror-themed story, this is absolutely going to scratch that itch, but don't expect it to go above and beyond. A large part of the reason is because of the story, so if you don't want to be spoiled, please skip to the time shown on the screen.
Yep, you made a big deal about it.
It doesn't smell.
The story of the suicide of Rachel Foster is interesting, mundane, great, awful, thrilling, boring, unexpected, and predictable all in one. Simply put, it's a mess and leaves the player with a lot to unpack. So I think firstly I should cover the events of the story. Again, this is your final warning for spoilers. If you're even remotely interested in this game, please don't watch this. To begin with, I do want to give a special shout out to the absolutely stellar intro to the game. You receive a letter from your mother explaining everything, the affair, the suicide, and what she wants of you. The reading of each letter is intercut with a bird's eye view of a person covered by an umbrella progressing forwards at a funeral with some very appropriately dramatic music to set the tone. This sequence ends once you reach the coffin and the scene moves to Nicole driving through thick snow to the hotel. After arriving at the hotel, Rachel discovers the person who was supposed to do the evaluation cannot make it due to the harshness of the weather, and it is now down to her. She initially fights this and intends to leave, but after a little running around and talking to Irving, she discovers she cannot find her car keys. This, combined with Irving's insistence that the weather poses a legitimate danger, leads her to spending a night at the hotel.
You there?
Oh, yeah, right. It's a direct line.
I can't find my car keys. My fucking car keys. I left them on the seat.
The next few days are reasonably uneventful. You will walk through the hotel and discover some oddities, a cordoned off area, and fix a fair few issues. These moments are used to build tension. Again, it is fairly tropey but effective. It is also, for the most part, avoiding any jump scares and creates horror in a much subtler way. Things like walking through darkness to fix lights, fixing the furnace in the basement, and receiving a threatening call from a broken phone. After this, things begin getting a lot more interesting as the mystery element unfolds. You will start finding items that might indicate Rachel Foster is still alive. You find fresh lipstick, articles claiming that she was sighted at the hotel, and it all culminates in finding the tools and recordings of ghost hunters in the hotel. Using these tools, the game then steps up the creep factor by having you track sounds only the equipment can pick up on. Before the finale of the game, two large events happen, the first of which is you sleepwalking into an old church that is connected to the hotel, which then leads you to the second, and what I can only assume is the hidden room of Rachel. After this finale begins, I'm not going to go into too much detail because I don't think there are many relevant details other than the main reveal. It turns out that Irving was the brother of Rachel and he was in the cordoned off area you would have seen during the game. It turns out he decided to set up everything to torture Nicole and find out any further information Nicole may have. At the very end of the game, you discover that Nicole actually did know something but had repressed it. She knew that her mother had killed Rachel, and seeing the blanket her mother hid the body in triggered the memory. All of this information is relayed to Irving, who then takes his own life before the game has its final scene. Nicole is revealed, sitting in her car. You can turn on the engine and the car begins filling with smoke. You then, as the player, have the choice of turning the engine off and sparing Nicole's life, or leaving it on until she passes out and dies, which has to be one of the heaviest choices I've made playing a video game. So I wouldn't normally list off the entire story of a game, but I have done so because it is by far the most important element of the game, and the thing that has torn me the most. On one hand, I like the story in a vacuum, but the game makes so many strange choices that I feel are at odds with said story. One is a mix of the completely grounded story and the supernatural elements. The implication is that Irving set up all of these to torture Nicole with the memory of Rachel, and to be fair, I think this is a pretty okay explanation for the majority of the events, such as the doors slamming, the fridge closing on Nicole, the lights going out, but then you have a good amount of stuff that seems a lot harder to explain like this. For example, the shimmering lights, the butterfly spirit you have to follow, and the sounds you follow using the ghost hunter's tools. I will say that despite some questionable moments and it initially not quite making sense, I do like the idea of Irving setting up a haunted hotel to play on the insecurities of Nicole, but considering this is what the devs were going for, I have to question a lot of the other choices in the game. As pacing is quite important to this game, I can't think of a good reason why you would want to have found object puzzles in the game at all. It means everyone who plays the game will experience the dialogue for each object in a different order, and if you can't find the relevant item, you might spend up to 10 minutes walking around a room aimlessly. Let me go into more detail. In the room with the Ghost Hunter's equipment, there are about 4 items that progress the story, but when I entered the room, the first thing I investigated was the tool required to collect for the next puzzle. By doing so, a glitch happened that caused it to despawn and not be in my inventory. This meant that during one of the most tense parts of the game, I was left to inspect every mundane item and had banter with Irving about some magazines, ruining the effect of the room. Now, obviously this is an extreme example, it's very unfortunate that a bug occurred, but I think it illustrates an issue that was persistent throughout the game. Personally, if I was the lead creative mind behind the game, I would have had only about 4 or 5 puzzles throughout the entire game and had them all been something like the sound tracking. Beyond this, I also think the inclusion of dialogue options was completely pointless. The idea was to make the conversation feel more natural, and it was clearly inspired by Firewatch. However, I found it had the complete opposite effect, as most of the time an option would only appear at the end of a sentence, leaving a silent space in the game that's supposed to have a believable chemistry between 2 characters. You can occasionally cut off Irving using dialogue options, which was the main purpose of this function in Firewatch, but in that game your conversational partner reacted much more dynamically. Here, it always feels rigid when it happens because Irving never responds to being cut off or checks if you are still there after a prolonged period of silence. So simply put, my main complaint amounts to feeling like the core idea of the story wasn't reinforced by the game's mechanics, nor how the dialogue was delivered, which is a shame because I think a lot of the individual elements and core ideas are pretty interesting, but they all end up holding each other back. Also, this is a minor point, but earlier I said the comparisons to The Shining are weak, and I believe this to be true. In fact, the only similarities are completely superficial. You could argue the hotel itself pays homage to The Shining, but in terms of themes, there is nothing to do with isolation or insanity. Personally, I believe the game is attempting to show you a deeply tragic story and lets you decide who you believe is at fault. The very fact you can decide whether Nicole lives or dies at the end is allowing the player to have moral judgment of her character, but I find this decision to be very bizarre because throughout basically all of this, Nicole was a bystander, unless you think she should have been kinder to Rachel when they were younger, but I hardly think she deserves death for it. And the only people I would pass judgment on personally would be Nicole's parents, but to explain why, I have to move on to another topic. In addition to the content warning on the screen, I also want to say that I'm going to be discussing a relationship with an incredibly large age gap. The final point I want to talk about is the relationship between Nicole's father and Rachel. It turns out that Rachel was only 16 when Nicole's father was with her. This is something you do not realise until around the midpoint of the game, and this game has received a fair amount of heat from other reviewers because it is presented as more tragic than creepy. In fact, when the relationship is spoken about, it is never referred to in a negative light beyond the way a standard affair would be, and even when Irving talks about it after it is revealed he is Rachel's brother, he says,
One day, that beautiful, luminous creature met someone. A human being that saw her. For real.
My dad.
Yes. And I was the invisible witness of what happened. A love. Simply a love. Nothing more, nothing less.
When you also consider both families seem to have interacted a lot and thus there is the implication that Rachel was groomed, I think it's very easy to say this game probably should have painted the father in a much worse light. No one ever calls him out for his incredibly creepy actions. I think it would have made a ton of sense for Nicole to hate her father. When you consider Rachel was heavily bullied in school, I think you could argue it makes sense for Irving to be the only one who could see these actions in a good light, because from his perspective his sister was happy, but personally I'm not sure if you could age 9 years and not realise how fucked up the actions of Nicole's father are. Having said that, regardless of believability, I think it is very clear Irving was massively traumatised, which is evidenced by the elaborate revenge setup and his suicide upon finding out Rachel was actually killed by Nicole's mother. Nicole's mother, on the other hand, I think is one of the least understandable characters in the entire story. In the opening letter, she clearly hates her husband and states that he did the right thing by throwing himself off a cliff, but again only sees his actions as a regular affair as opposed to the abuse it was, which I would say is evidenced by the fact she kills Rachel, which is a pretty extreme thing to do in a regular affair, let alone to someone so young. To be clear, I want to say that I think the game is somewhat socially irresponsible due to downplaying such an abusive and predatory relationship. However, it will not affect the score I give the game. What will affect the score are things like the poor writing of the mother's character. Overall, I think the suicide of Rachel Foster will be lost to the sands of time in terms of walking simulators. The areas in which it succeeds, like the pacing, are marred by the constant clashing of anti-synergistic elements. I'm glad I played it, and I maintain that the story is good despite its issues, but I would only recommend this if you have already played Firewatch and want something that scratches the same itch. 5 out of 10. The game can be picked up on Steam or Humble for £15, and I have left links in the description. If you would like to support the channel, I have provided my Humble partner link, which will not increase the price but will give me a little kickback on purchases. If you've enjoyed the video, please make sure to like or comment as it helps the video become more visible, and thanks for watching.
Get any sleep?
I slept like a rock. I forgot my bed was so comfy. So, any news?
What?